The wooden crates hit the pavement with a sharp thud as James finished arranging his stand. The familiar rhythm of the market was in full swing, kids tugging on their parents' sleeves for fresh pastries, an elderly couple laughing over who picked the better apples, and the hum of conversation filling the air. It was the kind of morning that made small-town life feel like something out of a postcard. James moved methodically, his hands working with a precision that seemed out of place for a man his size. He lifted a crate of tomatoes, one in each hand, effortless despite the weight. His large fingers were surprisingly gentle as he positioned the produce just right, ensuring everything looked inviting. "Morning, James," Ruth Whitaker greeted, adjusting the scarf around her neck. The woman had been coming to this market for decades, her presence as much a staple as the stands themselves. "Those tomatoes look as good as your grandmother's." James smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Same seeds she used to plant," he said, brushing some dust off the wooden table. "Some things are worth keeping the same." But as he spoke, something changed. The air around him shifted. A low rumble rolled through the valley, growing louder, more distinct. James knew the sound before he even turned his head. Motorcycles. 5 of them. The storm riders. He didn't react, didn't tense. Instead, he kept his hands moving, adjusting a basket of carrots as the bikes rolled into the market, their engines growling before cutting off one by one. Conversations around the market faded. Some vendors turned their backs. Others busied themselves, pretending not to notice. James, however, noticed everything. Python, the gang's leader, was the first to step forward. The man had the look of someone who enjoyed being feared. Leather cut draped over a broad frame, his arms covered in tattoos that told stories nobody wanted to ask about. Behind him, Sledge cracked his knuckles, grinning like a man who knew he'd get to break something before the morning was over. Reaper, the quiet one, lingered near the flower stand, watching everything with cold, unreadable eyes. The last 2 were new recruits, prospects trying too hard to look tough. James had seen this before, 1,000 times, in different places, under different circumstances. The gang wasn't just here to collect. They were here to make a statement. Python picked up a tomato from James's stand, rolling it between his fingers. "Nice setup you got," he said, smirking. James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up a crate of potatoes, setting them down with a deliberate slowness before finally meeting Python's gaze. "Appreciate it," he said evenly. Python took a slow bite from the tomato, chewing as he stared at James. Then, without warning, he spit the pulp onto the ground. James exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "We've been doing some thinking," Python continued. "Market's on our turf. If people want to keep selling, they gotta start showing some respect." James wiped his hands on his apron. "And how much does respect cost these days?" Python grinned. 50%. A laugh, low and amused, rumbled from James's chest. "That's ambitious." Sledge stepped forward, knocking over a small basket of cucumbers. They tumbled onto the ground, rolling under the table. James's fingers twitched at his side, but he stayed still. "You think something's funny, old man?" Sledge taunted. James finally moved. Slowly, carefully, he bent down and picked up a cucumber, brushing the dirt off. "Just thinking," he said, his voice still calm. "You boys ever hear that story about the wolf and the sheepdog?" Python narrowed his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" James tossed the cucumber back onto the pile. "Sheepdogs and wolves," he continued, wiping his hands on his overalls. "They look kind of the same, don't they? Both big, both strong. But there's one big difference." Python folded his arms, unimpressed. "And what's that?" James's eyes locked onto Python's, his voice dropping just enough that only the gang could hear. "A sheepdog isn't afraid of the wolf." For the first time, Python hesitated. It was small, barely noticeable, a flicker of uncertainty. But James caught it. The others didn't see it yet. They were still grinning, still waiting for the fat farmer to start sweating. They had no idea. James was done talking. They were about to learn the hard way. James Cooper wasn't always a farmer. 8 years ago, his life had been a very different one. Somewhere, locked away in classified files, buried under layers of redacted documents and blacked-out names, there existed a history that no one in Eagle's Rest knew about. A history of missions that never officially happened. A history of eliminating targets in places the US government would deny ever being. For 20 years, James had been part of an elite unit. Not just any unit, Delta Force. The kind of team called in when every other option had failed. The kind of men who operated in the shadows, took down entire compounds, and walked out without a scratch. James had spent half his life hunting the worst kind of people. Drug lords, war criminals, rogue military leaders. He had worked deep undercover, infiltrated organizations that no outsider had ever escaped from alive. His body had been tested beyond human limits, his mind sharpened into something unbreakable. But none of that was who he was now. At least, that's what he told himself. Now, he was a farmer, just a man who grew vegetables, woke up before dawn, and lived a quiet life in a quiet town. He had put on weight, nearly 100 pounds since he left the service. His face had softened, his beard had grayed. He was slower now, heavier, a man that looked harmless, and that was exactly the way he wanted it. Because a ghost with no past could not be hunted. For 8 years, he had built a new life for himself, pouring his strength into the land instead of into violence. He had rebuilt his family's farm, turned it into something real, something that mattered. But even in the silence of his new life, some habits refused to die. James never sat with his back to a door. He always noted the exits of a building. He could tell when someone was carrying a concealed weapon by the way their shirt creased over their waistband. He didn't own a single firearm, at least not officially, but he knew exactly how many rounds were stored in the sheriff's department downtown. He wasn't paranoid, just prepared, because men like him didn't get to walk away completely. The past had a way of finding you. And this morning, it had arrived in the form of 5 bikers who had no idea who they were dealing with. As Python and his crew rode out of the market, kicking up dust, James stood still, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his table. The other vendors had watched in stunned silence as the gang had rolled in, demanding payment, throwing their weight around, and they had all seen the way James had stood his ground. Nobody spoke at first. Then Ruth Whitaker stepped closer. "James," she said carefully, "are you sure that was wise?" James picked up a fallen tomato, brushing dirt off its surface. "Didn't see much of a choice?" She adjusted her scarf, glancing in the direction the bikers had gone. "They'll come back, and next time they won't be looking for a friendly chat." James nodded. He knew it too, but fear had never been something that dictated his actions. He had learned long ago that there were only 2 kinds of men in this world, those who let bullies take what they wanted and those who stopped them. And James Cooper had never been the first kind. He went back to arranging his produce, ignoring the looks from the other vendors. Let them whisper, let them wonder. What they thought didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in a long time, the old part of him, the part he had buried under years of farm work and quiet living, was awake again. By the time he got back to his farm that afternoon, the sun was sitting lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. James pulled his truck to a stop near the barn, stepping out with a grunt. The land stretched out before him, untouched except for the cattle grazing lazily near the fence line. The old house, weathered but sturdy, stood just beyond the dirt driveway. It should have felt peaceful, but James's mind was turning. He had read Python's body language, the way the gang leader had hesitated for just a second, that flicker of doubt in his eyes when James hadn't cowered like the other vendors. Python wasn't used to people pushing back, and a man like that, he wouldn't let it go. James stepped into the barn, closing the door behind him. He moved with purpose, weaving past old farming equipment and stacks of hay. Then, at the back, he stopped in front of what looked like a regular wooden wall. He reached for the bottom plank and pulled. The false panel slid open, revealing a hidden storage space behind it. Inside, there was no farm equipment. Instead, a locked steel cabinet sat against the wall. James knelt down, pressing his thumb against a hidden scanner. A soft click sounded, and the cabinet unlocked. He opened it slowly. Neatly organized inside were weapons he hadn't touched in years. A Sig Sauer P320, the same sidearm he had carried in his military days. A combat knife, the steel blade still sharp as the day he had last used it. A tactical vest, worn but functional, and beneath it all, a sealed envelope. James picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He knew exactly what was inside. A letter, one he had written years ago, addressed to no one. A letter meant to be opened if he ever had to disappear again. He set it down and took a long breath. This was supposed to be over. He had buried this life, walked away from it. But some men weren't meant for peace, and James Cooper had just been given a reason to remind the world exactly who he used to be. James stood by the fence of his property as the last of the evening sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in deep streaks of orange and purple. His calloused hands gripped the wooden railing, his fingers slowly curling and uncurling as he thought about what had happened that morning. He had told himself for years that the past was behind him, that he had built a life where no one would ever come looking for the man he used to be. But men like him didn't get peace. They got temporary illusions of it, little glimpses of quiet, before the world reminded them what they really were. And today, the world had sent a reminder in the form of 5 bikers who had no idea they had just walked into a war. He knew what was coming next. Python wasn't the kind of man to accept humiliation. James had read it in his face, in the way his jaw had clenched, in the way his fingers had twitched near his belt where a weapon was likely hidden. The gang would be back. It wasn't a question of if, only when. But it wouldn't be like this morning. They wouldn't come back laughing. They wouldn't swagger up with cocky grins, chewing on stolen produce, acting like they ran the town. No, the next time they came, it would be for blood. James let out a slow breath, his mind working through every possibility. The farm was large, open, with too many access points. The main house sat at the heart of the property, solidly built but vulnerable. The barn was the only structure fortified well enough to withstand an attack. It had been built by his grandfather back when men expected trouble and built accordingly. It had thick wooden beams, an old root cellar beneath it, and a heavy metal door that could be secured if needed. The cattle in the backfield grazed lazily, oblivious to the storm coming. He envied them. James turned and walked back toward the house, his boots crunching against the gravel. His mind was already forming a plan. First, he needed to secure the perimeter. He reached the back porch and bent down to lift a loose floorboard, a little trick he had installed himself. Underneath, wrapped in an old cloth, sat a pair of binoculars and a secured satellite phone. He grabbed the binoculars, tucking them under his arm as he walked to the edge of the property where he had a clear view of the road leading in and out of town. With a practiced ease, he lifted the binoculars to his eyes, scanning the distance. The town was quiet. No headlights, no sign of movement from the direction the bikers had gone. But that didn't mean they weren't planning something. He watched for a few minutes longer before lowering the binoculars. His next move was simple. They thought he was just a farmer. That was good. That was useful. He needed them to keep thinking that. Let them believe he was just some stubborn old man who didn't know when to back down. Let them think they had him where they wanted him. Let them think he was weak. He turned on his heel and walked toward the barn, sliding open the heavy wooden door. The scent of hay, oil, and earth filled the space, comforting in its familiarity. But James wasn't here for farm work. He reached the far wall where an old workbench sat covered in rusted tools and broken machinery. He reached behind it, feeling for the latch. Another hidden compartment, another insurance policy from a life he had left behind. With a sharp click, the panel loosened, revealing a small armory. He had never intended to use it, but life had a way of forcing a man's hand. James pulled out a case and flipped it open. Inside lay a semi-automatic shotgun, a weapon that had seen its fair share of action. Next to it, a pair of tactical knives, a set of brass knuckles, a military-grade flashlight with a strobe setting designed to disorient attackers. He reached for the shotgun first, checking its condition. He had cleaned it monthly out of habit, never quite able to let go of old instincts. The weapon was as ready as it had ever been. James set it aside and picked up the brass knuckles, turning them over in his hands. They were heavier than they looked, solid, the kind of weapon a man used when he wanted to send a message. The memory hit him before he could stop it. Another time, another place, a cold, wet alley in a country most Americans had never heard of, a target with too many guards, too many eyes, a mission that had required silence, the way his fist had connected, the way a man twice his size had dropped like a sack of bricks, the sound of ribs breaking. James closed his eyes for a moment, pushing the memory back down where it belonged. That was then. This was now. He set the brass knuckles down and pulled out a roll of barbed wire. It wasn't much, but it would help. He would reinforce the barn entrance, making sure no one got inside without bleeding for it. James worked quickly, his hands moving with a speed that came from years of muscle memory. He secured the barn's doors, set up a makeshift perimeter with tripwires. Nothing fancy, just enough to alert him if someone tried to sneak up on the property. By the time he finished, the sky had turned dark and the air had cooled. He leaned against the barn door, wiping sweat from his forehead. He was older now, slower. His joints ached in ways they never used to. But none of that mattered. He had fought worse battles than this. James turned his gaze toward the hills, toward the road leading back to town. They would come. And when they did, he'd be waiting. The dim glow of a flickering neon sign cast long shadows across the cracked pavement outside a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. The Storm Riders weren't the kind of gang that hid in the shadows. They were the type that made their presence known. And tonight, their presence was loud. The music inside was deafening, a wall of pounding drums and screeching guitars shaking the wooden walls. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, alcohol, and cigarette smoke. Men with worn leather cuts sat in clusters, laughing, shouting, slamming bottles against tables. But at one table in the back, there was no laughter, no shouting, just a silence that carried more weight than the noise around it. Python sat stiffly, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he stared at the empty beer bottle in front of him. The others watched him carefully, waiting. Sledge leaned in, his massive forearms resting on the table. "That fat bastard made you look weak today, boss." Python's eyes flicked up, locking onto him. Sledge grinned, his thick fingers tightening around a pool cue. "I say we burn his whole damn farm down." Reaper, who had been silent until now, shook his head. "Too obvious. Town's already got eyes on us. Cops would be all over it." Python took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His pride screamed for him to act now, to take his men and ride straight to that farm, drag the fat farmer out by his throat and make him beg. But Reaper was right. They had been getting away with a lot in Eagle's Rest, but if they started burning down property, the law would have no choice but to crack down. Still, something had to be done. "You think he's just some stubborn old farmer?" Python muttered. "That wasn't stubborn. That was something else." Sledge scoffed. "Guy's just a big dumb hick. He got lucky." Python slammed his fist against the table so hard that the nearby conversation stopped. "Does that look like luck to you?" He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the deep bruises on his wrist, where James had grabbed his gun earlier that day. The pain hadn't gone away. Sledge frowned. "Hell, guy's stronger than he looks." Python flexed his fingers. "Stronger, faster, too damn calm, and he took apart my gun in seconds like it was a damn toy." Reaper rubbed his chin. "Maybe he's ex-military." Python's eyes darkened. Or worse. Silence fell over the table. They had all heard stories, the kind of men that existed in the world, the kind of ghosts that looked like ordinary people but weren't, the kind of men who, when pushed, didn't just push back, they ended the fight. Finally, Python straightened up. His pride burned, but his mind was sharp enough to know that rushing in wasn't the answer. "We're not just going to hurt him," he said. "We're going to make an example out of him. Show the whole damn town what happens when someone crosses us." Sledge grinned. "So we torch his farm?" Python shook his head. "Number, we do this smart. We hit him where it hurts first." Reaper raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" Python's lips curled into a cold smile. "The market." The others looked at him, waiting for the plan. Python leaned forward. "Tomorrow morning we go back. Not to talk, not to threaten, to break things. His stall, his produce. Hell, maybe even some of the other vendors, just to send a message. We make it clear, he backs down, or next time we come for him." Sledge cracked his knuckles. "I like the sound of that." Reaper, ever the cautious one, narrowed his eyes. "You sure that's a good idea? If he really is ex-military, he's not going to scare easy." Python smirked. "That's fine. We're not here to scare him. We're here to show everyone else that standing with him means getting hurt." Sledge let out a chuckle. "Tomorrow's gonna be fun." Python downed the rest of his beer in one gulp and slammed the bottle on the table. "Get some rest, boys. We ride at dawn." The early morning fog clung low over the town as the first vendors arrived at Eagle's Rest Farmers Market. The usual warmth of the small-town gathering wasn't there today. There was tension, a whisper of something wrong. The news had spread fast. The Storm Riders had been humiliated yesterday, and when a gang like that took a hit to their pride, they always came back. James Cooper knew it too. He had been up before dawn, like always. But instead of checking his crops or tending to the cattle, he had been reinforcing his market stall, quietly, carefully, making sure that when the Storm Riders came, they would leave with more than just bruised egos. He moved with the same steady calm he always had, but his mind was racing through 100 scenarios. He had counted every possible exit, memorized the weight and movement of every wooden crate, scanned the crowd for any object that could be turned into a weapon. The past was coming for him again. And this time it was riding in on motorcycles. At 8:47 a.m. the rumble returned. Louder this time. They weren't trying to be subtle. The market grew still as the Storm Riders rounded the corner. Python led the way, his eyes locked onto James's stall like a predator stalking prey. Behind him, Sledge, Reaper, and 2 more gang members rolled in, forming a tight V formation. Vendors froze. Some grabbed their things and left. Others turned away, pretending not to notice. James didn't move. He just finished arranging his tomatoes as if the gang wasn't even there. Python dismounted, his boots scuffing the pavement. He walked straight up to James's stall and grabbed a crate of produce, lifting it just high enough, then slamming it down onto the table, sending vegetables spilling everywhere. James exhaled slowly. "That's supposed to mean something?" he asked, his voice calm. Python smirked. "Yeah, it means your little stand doesn't exist unless we say it does." James nodded slightly, as if considering it. Then, without a word, he picked up a fallen tomato and placed it back onto the table. The gang watched, waiting for him to get angry, to lash out, to give them an excuse. But James just kept working, unbothered, unshaken. It infuriated Python. Sledge stepped forward, gripping the edge of the table. "Maybe we didn't make ourselves clear." That was his mistake, because James had already moved. Before Sledge could react, James's thick fingers clamped down over his wrist and twisted, hard. There was a sickening crack, followed by a scream. Sledge dropped to one knee, clutching his arm. The market gasped. Python's hand shot to his waistband, reaching for his knife. But James was already there. A sharp jab to the nerve cluster in Python's wrist sent the blade clattering to the ground. In the same motion, James pivoted, planting his boot against the side of Python's knee, knocking him off balance. It happened too fast. Reaper reached for something in his jacket. James caught his movement, stepping in with a heavy shoulder strike that sent Reaper stumbling backward. For a moment, nobody moved. Then James exhaled, looking down at Python, who was now on the ground. "You boys done playing?" Python looked up at him, his face twisted with rage. No words, just hatred and a silent promise. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The night was quiet, too quiet. James sat on his front porch, rocking slowly in an old wooden chair that had been on this farm longer than he had. The crickets sang their usual song in the fields, the breeze whispered through the tall grass, and the stars above seemed indifferent to the trouble brewing below. But James knew better. There was a difference between peaceful silence and the kind that came before a storm. He sipped his coffee, black, no sugar, and let his mind work through the details. The bikers had taken their beating at the market, but men like Python weren't the type to let something like that go. He had seen it in their eyes when they left, especially Python's. That wasn't anger, that was something worse. Calculating rage. Python wasn't just going to come back swinging. He would think it through first. Plan. Gather his crew. He would be smarter about it this time. But James had learned something too. The gang wasn't just a bunch of road thugs running protection rackets and bar fights. They moved like men who had seen real violence. The way they handled themselves, the way they took formation. Python and at least a few of them had military training. Maybe not top tier, but enough to make them dangerous. James could feel it. They weren't just coming to scare him. They were coming to remove him. He finished his coffee, set the cup down on the railing, and stood up. His old bones protested the motion, but he ignored them. He had work to do. The first thing he did was check his perimeter. The farm was big, too big to fully secure. There were multiple entry points, a long dirt road leading in, and open fields stretching into the darkness. If they wanted to, the gang could attack from almost any direction, but James had the advantage of knowing his own land better than anyone. He started with the fences. The eastern side of the property was the most vulnerable, wide open, nothing but wooden posts and wire stretching out toward the hills. He reinforced a few weak points, tightening loose barbed wire and setting up a simple tripwire system near the main break points. Nothing fancy, just a little surprise for anyone trying to sneak in. Next, he moved to the barn. Inside, the old wooden structure smelled of hay, oil, and the familiar scent of hard work. The place had been in his family for generations, and over the years he had modified it for more than just farming. James pulled open a hidden compartment near the tool rack, revealing a small storage area filled with supplies he hadn't touched in years. A few homemade flashbangs, some signal jammers, and a couple of old but well-maintained weapons he had kept just in case. Tonight, just in case had arrived. He grabbed a tactical flashlight and set it on the workbench, then pulled out an old pump-action shotgun. He hadn't used it in years, but as he racked the slide, the motion was as familiar as breathing. He loaded it with shells and placed it within arm's reach. He wasn't looking for a fight, but if they brought one to him, he damn well wasn't going to lose it. After setting up motion sensors around the property, James took one last look around before heading inside. The house was as ready as it could be. Doors reinforced, weak points secured. He left one lamp on in the living room, just enough to make it look like he wasn't completely asleep. Then he waited, and at 11:47 p.m. they arrived. The first sign was the vibration in the ground, a low, distant rumble that grew closer with every second. James didn't have to look. He knew the sound of motorcycles when he heard them. He peered through the window, watching as 5 bikes and a black SUV rolled down his dirt road. Their headlights were off, moving like shadows, silent and precise. They were being careful this time. Good. James exhaled, slow and controlled. His pulse stayed steady. His breathing never changed. He had been in worse situations, a lot worse. From his position, he counted at least 8 men. The SUV was likely carrying backup. He noted how they moved, splitting into teams, covering angles. These weren't just angry bikers looking for revenge. This was a planned hit. James felt something deep in his chest. Not fear, not anxiety. Something colder, something sharper. The old instincts were waking up again. One of the bikers, a lanky man with a crowbar, made his way toward the barn. motioning for another to follow. The plan was obvious. Destroy the farmer's property first, make him come outside, force him into the open. James watched as the first man reached the barn doors. Then, without warning, boom! The tripwire grenade exploded, sending a bright flash of white-hot light into the night. The biker closest to the door was knocked off his feet, landing hard on the ground, clutching his ears. The second staggered back, blinded. Shouts erupted. "What the hell? It's a trap!" James was already moving. He grabbed the shotgun, stepped onto the porch, and fired a single warning shot into the air. The blast echoed across the fields like thunder. The bikers froze. "You boys took a wrong turn," James called out, his voice steady, carrying just enough authority to cut through the night. "I suggest you rethink your evening plans." Python stepped forward from the SUV, his face shadowed by the dim moonlight. Unlike the others, he wasn't rattled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, old man," he said. "You should have just paid up." James tilted his head. "And you should have walked away when you had the chance." Python sighed and gestured toward his men. "Take him." They moved fast. James moved faster. The first one up the porch reached for him. James grabbed his wrist, twisted, and slammed the man's face into the wooden railing. The second lunged. James sidestepped, driving his elbow into the biker's ribs, sending him gasping to the ground. Sledge came next, swinging a crowbar. James ducked, grabbed him by the jacket, and with one swift motion hurled the 250-pound man off the porch like he was nothing. Python stood back, watching, something unreadable in his expression. He wasn't just seeing an old man fight. He was seeing something else, something dangerous. James leveled the shotgun at him. "Last chance to leave walking." Python exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "I'll give you this, old man. You're tougher than you look." James smirked. "You have no idea." For a moment, it looked like Python might push his luck. But then, slowly, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right," he said. "You win this round." He nodded to his men, the ones still conscious, and they began retreating toward their bikes. But James knew better. This wasn't over. Python wasn't the type to accept a loss. No, he was regrouping, planning something bigger. James watched them disappear into the night. He didn't lower the shotgun until the sound of engines faded completely. Then, slowly, he turned back toward his house. The past wasn't done with him yet, and he wasn't done with it either. The farm was quiet again, but James knew it was an illusion, the kind of silence that didn't mean peace. It meant unfinished business. He stood at the edge of his porch, shotgun still in his hands, watching the distant dust trail that marked the bikers' retreat. They would be back, not tonight, not after the embarrassment they had just suffered, but soon. James exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his beard. His pulse was steady, his breathing was even. He had expected this moment for a long time. He turned back toward the house, stepping over one of the unconscious bikers still sprawled on the ground. He nudged the man's boot with his own. "You still breathing?" A groan answered him. James shook his head and kept walking. He wasn't going to waste time with stragglers. Let them wake up and crawl back to their crew with broken ribs and bruised egos. Let them tell Python exactly what they had walked into. Maybe then the gang would start to understand who they were dealing with. Inside, James locked the door behind him and set the shotgun down on the table. His house was simple, nothing fancy. A sturdy wooden kitchen table, a faded recliner in the corner. The walls lined with bookshelves filled with old Western novels and survival guides. But hidden beneath the homey simplicity was a different kind of reality. James moved toward the hallway, stopping at the closet near the end. He pressed his palm against the back panel, feeling for the hidden latch. With a quiet click, the false wall swung open, revealing something no one in Eagle's Rest had ever seen. A secured room, small but efficient. Maps, files, surveillance monitors, and weapons, clean, stored, but ready. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't fear. This was preparation. James had always known this day might come. He took a seat at the desk, flipping open a worn leather notebook. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, tactical observations. He had been watching the storm riders for months, long before they ever paid attention to him. They weren't just some biker gang shaking down local businesses for protection money. They were part of something bigger. James tapped a finger on one of the pages, an organizational chart he had pieced together over time. The storm riders weren't operating alone. They were muscle for someone higher up, someone who had real power. And if they had access to the kind of resources James had seen tonight, then that meant only one thing. They were tied into weapons trafficking. That explained everything. Their growing presence, their increased aggression, the sudden shift from petty extortion to real violence. Somebody was funding them, somebody with military connections. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years avoiding this kind of life, burying himself in dirt and farm work, pretending he could just be a normal man. But normal men didn't get targeted by highly trained criminals, and they sure as hell didn't fight them off with the efficiency he had just displayed. James closed the notebook and stood up. His body was sore from the fight, but he ignored it. There was no time to rest. There was work to do. By morning, the town was already buzzing with rumors. Word had spread fast about what had happened at the market, about how James had taken on the storm riders and sent them limping away. People whispered about it in hushed voices over their morning coffee, retelling the story with increasing exaggeration. 5 of them came at him, and he didn't even break a sweat. He took them apart barehanded. They say pythons still spitting out teeth. James didn't care for gossip, but in this case it was useful. The more people talked, the more pressure it put on the gang, and pressure made men reckless. James parked his truck outside Jenny's cafe, stepping out into the morning sun. The small diner had been a staple in town for decades, serving coffee and breakfast to farmers, truckers, and anyone looking for a decent meal. As soon as he walked in, the conversations dipped for just a moment. Eyes flicked toward him, curious, cautious. Jenny, the owner, stood behind the counter, hands on her hips. She was younger than him by at least 20 years, but had the no-nonsense attitude of someone who had been running things for a lifetime. "Well, well," she said, pouring a cup of coffee, "if it isn't the local celebrity." James sighed and took a seat at the counter. "That bad?" Jenny slid the cup toward him. "Depends on if you like being the talk of the town." He took a sip. "I don't." She smirked. "Then you probably shouldn't go around tossing bikers like sacks of potatoes." James didn't answer. He just kept drinking his coffee. Jenny leaned in, lowering her voice. "They were here earlier." James looked up. "Who?" "Storm riders. 3 of them. Not the usual muscle. These guys were different." She hesitated. "Professional. They didn't threaten me outright, but they were asking questions. About you, your past, where you came from." James set his cup down slowly. "And what did you tell them?" Jenny raised an eyebrow. "I told them you're a stubborn old farmer who probably doesn't even own a TV." He smirked. "Good answer." She crossed her arms. "They're not going away, James. I know." Jenny hesitated again. "Who are you, really?" James didn't answer right away. He could have lied, could have spun some story, but Jenny wasn't stupid. "I used to be someone else," he finally said. "A long time ago." Jenny studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, whoever you used to be, just don't get yourself killed now." James gave her a small nod of thanks and stood up. As he walked out of the cafe, he caught sight of something across the street, a black SUV. It was parked just far enough away to seem casual, but James recognized the pattern, the way it hadn't moved, the way the tinted windows were angled just so, giving the driver a clear view of the cafe entrance. He could feel their eyes on him. They weren't hiding anymore. Python was done playing, and that meant James had to stop waiting. He drove straight back to the farm, his mind already working through his next move. He had spent years avoiding the fight, hoping he could just exist in the quiet. But the quiet was gone. He pulled up to the barn and grabbed his gear. Not just the shotgun this time, not just a few scattered defenses. If they wanted a war, they were going to get one. Because James wasn't just some farmer. And now, they were about to find out exactly what kind of man they had messed with. James sat at his workbench in the barn, staring down at the pile of disassembled weapons laid out before him. His hands moved with the same precision they had in another life, reassembling his gear with a quiet efficiency that no ordinary farmer should possess. It was happening again. He could feel it creeping back into his bones, that sharp edge he had spent years dulling with early mornings and honest labor. He had convinced himself that life was over, that he had buried it under layers of normalcy. But war had a way of finding men like him, and now it had come knocking on his front door. He finished loading his shotgun and placed it beside him. Next to it, he laid out a few other tools of his trade, a combat knife, a reinforced pair of knuckle dusters, and a modified taser strong enough to drop a bull. None of this would be necessary if Python and his men had any sense, but James already knew they didn't. He leaned back, rubbing his fingers over the scar on his forearm, an old reminder of a knife fight in a place he tried not to think about. He had been lucky that time, but luck didn't mean much when the enemy was relentless, and the storm riders weren't backing down. Jenny's warning at the cafe had confirmed what James already suspected. The gang wasn't just mad about getting humiliated. They were investigating him. That changed everything. It meant they weren't just coming for revenge. They wanted answers. Who was he? Where had he learned to fight like that? Why wasn't he afraid of them? And most importantly, who else might he be connected to? James knew their type. Small-time criminals didn't ask those kinds of questions. They just broke things and moved on. But Python was thinking bigger, and that meant whoever was backing him was asking those questions too. James stood up, grabbing his shotgun and slinging it over his shoulder. He had spent years preparing for the possibility that someone would come looking for him, but he had always imagined it would be men in suits, government agents tracking down ghosts from old missions. He never thought it would be a gang of bikers with more money and training than they should have. That was the part that bothered him the most. The Storm Riders were too well equipped, too disciplined. They weren't just some gang running backroad drug deals and shaking down small businesses. Somebody had invested in them, and James needed to find out who. The sun was setting when he drove back into town, the sky burning red and gold over the rooftops. Eagle's Rest was the kind of town that shut down early, but tonight James wasn't headed for the cafe or the market. He was going to the one place where he knew he'd find answers, the Black Dog. It was the only real bar in town, the kind of place that had seen more fights than friendly conversations. A handful of locals drank there, but it was mostly a haunt for truckers, drifters, and men who didn't want their names remembered. And tonight it would be full of storm riders. James parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance on foot, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, casting sickly blue light onto the parking lot. Motorcycles lined the curb, at least a dozen of them, their chrome reflecting the last traces of daylight. Inside, the music was loud, the air thick with the stink of beer and sweat. James stepped through the door and felt the weight of eyes immediately turned toward him. The bar wasn't just full of bikers, it was their place, a safe haven for men like Python and Sledge, where they didn't expect to be challenged. James had just changed that. He walked straight to the bar, ignoring the murmurs and the tightening grips on pool cues. He ordered a whiskey, paid in cash, and turned to scan the room. Python was in the back, seated in a booth with 3 of his men. His knuckles were still bruised from their last encounter, and there was a deep purpling mark along his jaw where James had put him on the ground. For a second, Python just stared at him. Then a slow smirk spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, leaning back in his seat, "if it isn't the fat farmer." James took a sip of his drink unfazed. "Evening?" The men on either side of Python shifted, ready for a fight, but James didn't move. He didn't need to. Python studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the empty seat across from him. "You came all this way. Sit." James took the offer, lowering himself into the booth. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Python nodded toward him. "I've been asking around. People say you're just a simple farmer, a man who took over his daddy's land after retiring from some government job back east." James shrugged. "Sounds about right." Python grinned. "Problem is, men like you don't fight like that." James let the silence stretch. Let them stew in the uncertainty. Finally he leaned forward, setting his glass on the table. "You got something you want to ask me, son?" Python's smirk faded. His eyes darkened. "Who the hell are you?" James let the question hang in the air. Then he smiled. "No one you want to meet in the dark." Python's hand twitched toward his belt, probably expecting a weapon. James's smile didn't fade. "Go on, try it." The tension in the room snapped like a coiled wire. Python exhaled, sitting back again, his smirk returning, forced this time. He waved his hand. "Relax, boys. We're just talking." The others hesitated but eased off. James nodded toward the half-empty whiskey glass in Python's hand. "You're smarter than your boys give you credit for. I see that. You got the look of a man who thinks ahead." Python studied him, saying nothing. "So tell me something," James continued, voice calm. "A man like you, why is he working for someone else?" A flicker of something in Python's eyes, just for a second. James caught it. "Because that's what's happening, isn't it?" he pressed. "You're not just running some backroad gang. Someone's funding you. Someone's giving you gear, weapons, training." Python's fingers tapped against the wood of the table. A tell. He knew James was right. James leaned in, lowering his voice. "You're not in charge. Not really. You're just the middleman. So, who's at the top of the food chain?" Python let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You know, you talk too much for a guy who's outnumbered." James grinned. "And you hesitate too much for a man who thinks he's in control." Python didn't answer. But James had seen enough. He stood downing the last of his whiskey before setting the glass on the table. "I'll be seeing you soon." Then he turned and walked out. Not a single man in the bar stopped him. Outside, the night air was crisp, the scent of rain on the wind. James adjusted his jacket, heading back toward his truck. He had his answer. Python was scared. Not of him, of whoever owned him. And that meant James wasn't just dealing with a gang. He was dealing with something much bigger. James drove through the darkened streets of Eagle's Rest, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. The meeting at the Black Dog had told him everything he needed to know, not in words, but in what wasn't said. Python was scared, not of James, not even of losing face in front of his gang. He was scared of whoever was really pulling the strings. James had seen men like Python before, tough guys who thought they were kings of their little empires, until they realized they were just pawns on someone else's chessboard. And right now, Python was feeling the pressure. That meant James had leverage, and leverage meant opportunity. He turned onto the long dirt road leading back to his farm, headlights bouncing against the uneven terrain. His mind was already working through the next steps. He needed intel, not just on Python, but on who was funding the Storm Riders, because the more he dug into this, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a gang shaking down a small town for protection money. This was bigger. Weapons, training, money. Somebody was investing in these men. And if there was one thing James knew from his past life, it was that nobody invested in criminals unless they expected a return. That meant one of two things. Either the Storm Riders were being used as foot soldiers for something bigger, or they were sitting on top of an operation they didn't fully understand. Either way, James needed to find out who was bankrolling them, and that meant he needed to track their movements. Back at the farm, he went straight to the barn. He hadn't slept in almost 2 days, but that didn't matter. He had a job to do. Inside, the space was still cluttered with farm tools, hay bales, and old wooden crates. But behind the tool rack, hidden under a top, was something that hadn't seen daylight in years. James pulled it free. a military-grade drone. It wasn't just some store-bought model. This was the real deal. Long-range, night vision, encrypted communication systems. He had acquired it back in his other life, one of the few pieces of technology he had never quite been willing to part with. He placed it on the workbench and powered it up, the soft hum of electronics filling the air. The small screen lit up, the display feeding in live data as the rotors warmed up. James typed in coordinates, his fingers moving quickly. He had already mapped out the Storm Riders' known locations, the bar, the warehouse near the train tracks, and, of course, their compound on the outskirts of town. That's where he would start. With a quiet whir, the drone lifted into the air, disappearing into the night. James sat back, watching the feed as the landscape below unfolded in shades of green. The town shrank behind him, roads stretching out like veins in the dark. Then, in the distance, the compound. A few years ago, it had been an abandoned trucking yard, nothing more than rusted-out buildings and overgrown pavement. But now it was a fortress. High fences, multiple security cameras, armed men patrolling in pairs. James narrowed his eyes. That wasn't standard gang behavior. Most criminals didn't invest in perimeter security. They relied on fear to keep people away. But whoever was backing the Storm Riders had different priorities. He zoomed in on one of the vehicles parked near the main building, a black SUV, the same kind he had seen outside Jenny's cafe. And next to it, a man in military gear, not leather, not denim, tactical equipment. James' grip tightened. This was confirmation. Python wasn't the real threat. The men in those SUVs, the ones with military training and expensive gear, they were the real players. James watched as they spoke with the bikers, handing off crates from the back of a truck. He couldn't see inside, but he didn't have to. He knew exactly what was in those crates. Weapons. The gang wasn't just using them, they were distributing them, which meant Eagle's Rest wasn't just a small town getting bullied by criminals. It was a hub in a much larger operation. James leaned forward, watching as one of the men checked his watch, then turned toward the main warehouse. He typed a command into the drone's controls, sending it higher, scanning the building from above. Heat signatures popped up on the screen, dozens of them, more than just bikers, more than just a gang, an army. James exhaled slowly. His instincts had been right. The Storm Riders weren't just some local nuisance. They were part of something much larger, and that meant time was running out. He retrieved the drone and powered it down, running through everything he had just seen. Weapons, security, organization. Whoever was behind this had money, real money, and if they were willing to invest this much into a gang like the Storm Riders, that meant they had plans. James didn't intend to find out what those plans were the hard way. He pulled out his old secure phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Yeah?" James hesitated for half a second, then spoke. "It's me." A long pause, then, "Well, shit, thought you were dead." "Not yet," James said. The voice on the other end chuckled. "That why you're calling?" "No," James said. "I need information." Another pause. Then the voice got serious. "All right, who?" James glanced at the drone footage again. A biker gang, Storm Riders, but they're being funded by someone bigger. Military gear, tactical training, weapons distribution. The voice on the other end let out a low whistle. "Sounds like someone setting up shop." "Yeah," James muttered, "and I need to know who." There was a beat of silence. Then, "I'll see what I can find. Might take some time." "Don't have time," James said. "They're moving now." The voice exhaled. "All right, I'll dig. But you better watch your back, old man. If they're military funded, you're kicking a hornet's nest." James smirked. "Yeah, but I got a bigger boot." He ended the call, setting the phone down. The pieces were falling into place. Python was just a front. The real threat was still in the shadows, and James had just announced that he was coming for them. James sat on his porch, the weight of the call still heavy in his mind. The night stretched out before him, the kind of silence that only deep country could offer. But James didn't trust silence, not anymore. He had spent years listening to the world in ways most people couldn't understand. The way the wind shifted before a storm, the way animals reacted when something unnatural entered their space, the way the night seemed to hold its breath before violence erupted. And right now, the night was holding its breath. James leaned back in his chair, his shotgun resting across his lap. He wasn't expecting an attack tonight, but he also knew Python and his men weren't going to just disappear, especially not after what he had done to them. Python wasn't the kind of man who handled embarrassment well, and now that James had rattled his cage, the gang leader would be looking for a way to strike back. But it wasn't just about pride anymore. The Storm Riders weren't just a gang. They were a business that someone powerful had invested in. James had disrupted that business, and that meant whoever was funding them was watching now too. The thought didn't scare him, but it did make things more complicated. He took a slow breath and thought through his next move. He couldn't just wait for them to come for him. He needed to go on the offensive. And that started with finding out exactly who was behind the Storm Riders. He stood up, stretched his back, and headed inside. He wasn't going to sleep tonight. He had work to do. By midnight, James had everything he needed laid out on his kitchen table, a map of Eagle's Rest and the surrounding areas, notes he had taken over the last few weeks, the drone footage from the Storm Riders' compound, and a small battered notebook filled with names, numbers, and scribbled observations. James didn't just plan fights. He studied them, every operation he had ever been part of, every mission, every battle. It had all been built on intelligence, knowing the terrain, knowing the enemy, knowing how they moved, when they moved, and what they feared. Python and his gang had numbers, but James had strategy. He picked up a red marker and drew a circle around the Storm Riders' compound. That was their base of operations, but it wasn't where the real power was. If they were just a distribution point, that meant their supply line had to be coming from somewhere else. That was his next target. If he could cut off their supply, he could put the pressure on Python in a way the gang leader couldn't ignore. James flipped open his old notebook. Buried in the pages, written in faded ink, was a name: Victor Malone. James had known men like Malone his entire life. A former military contractor turned arms dealer, Malone had spent the last decade bouncing between private security firms and underground weapons trades. He had the kind of connections that didn't exist on paper, the kind that made people disappear when they became inconvenient. And now it looked like he was the one supplying the Storm Riders. James tapped his fingers against the table. Malone was smart, too smart to deal directly with a gang like Python's, which meant he had middlemen, distributors. If James could find one of them, he could track the supply line straight back to Malone himself. But that meant baiting a response. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before the voice from earlier answered. "You don't waste time, do you?" "No," James said. "I need more on Victor Malone, specifically his logistics, supply chains, routes." A low whistle. "That's not an easy ask. Malone runs tight, doesn't leave digital footprints." "Then find someone who knows him," James said. "Someone on the ground, a distributor, a courier, someone he trusts." A pause. Then, "I might have something. One of Malone's runners is operating out of the next town over. Small-time guy, but he handles shipments for bigger clients." James leaned forward. "Name?" "Logan Pierce." James wrote it down. "Where do I find him?" "Pierce runs security at a private club just outside the city, the Hollow. You're not getting in without an invitation." "I'll find a way," James said, a short chuckle on the other end. "Yeah, I figured. Just be careful. Malone's people aren't your average thugs. You go after them, they'll come after you." "They already are," James muttered. He hung up. Then he grabbed his keys. Time to pay. The Hollow a visit. The club sat on the edge of the county, far enough from Eagle's Rest that it wasn't technically anyone's problem. The kind of place where men with too much money and too little conscience went to enjoy themselves. James parked his truck a quarter-mile away and walked the rest of the distance on foot. He didn't like bringing vehicles too close to places he might need to leave in a hurry. From the outside, the hollow looked like an old warehouse, repurposed with expensive blacked-out windows and a security team that definitely wasn't hired off Craigslist. 2 men stood outside the entrance, both armed. Not bikers, professionals. James kept walking. He wasn't interested in the front door. He circled around the building, moving quietly through the trees. He could hear the muffled bass of the music inside, feel the faint vibration of it under his boots. Then, movement near the loading dock. 2 more guards stood near the back entrance, talking in low voices. James crouched in the darkness, watching. They weren't expecting trouble. Their postures were relaxed, their weapons slung casually over their shoulders. Amateurs. James moved quickly. He closed the distance before they even noticed. The first man barely had time to register the blur of motion before James drove his fist into his throat, cutting off any chance of a warning cry. The second guard reached for his gun. Too slow. James grabbed his wrist, twisted, and slammed his elbow into the man's temple. Both were unconscious before they hit the ground. James checked his watch. Less than 5 seconds. Not bad for an old farmer. He dragged the bodies behind a stack of crates and slipped inside the building. The air was thick with cigar smoke and expensive cologne. The inside of the hollow was exactly what he expected. Leather couches, glass tables, high-end liquor. And Logan Pierce, sitting in the corner with a blonde on his lap. James didn't waste time. He crossed the room in a straight line, reached out, and grabbed Pierce by the collar. Before anyone could react, James slammed him onto the table. Glass shattered. Drinks spilled. The club erupted. Pierce gasped, struggling, but James had already pulled him up by the throat. "Where does Malone keep his shipments?" James growled. Pierce's eyes darted around, looking for help. James tightened his grip. "Answer me." Pierce coughed, panic flashing across his face. I don't know exact locations. I just handle drop-offs." James leaned closer. "Then tell me where the next one is." Pierce hesitated. James reached for his knife. That ended the hesitation real fast. "There's a truck moving through Route 16 tomorrow night," Pierce gasped. "Weapons shipment. I swear, that's all I know." James nodded. Then he let go. Pierce collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. James adjusted his jacket, turned, and walked out. He had what he came for. Now it was time to hit them where it hurt. James drove down the dark, empty stretch of Route 16, his headlights cutting through the thick fog rolling in from the valley. The world outside was silent, just the sound of his engine, the hum of the tires on cracked asphalt, and the distant rustling of trees swaying in the wind. But James wasn't focused on the road. He was thinking about the truck, the shipment. He had forced Logan Pierce to give him everything he knew, and the pieces of the puzzle had finally come together. The Storm Riders weren't just some outlaw gang selling stolen pistols and shotguns. They were moving heavy military-grade weapons, and someone with serious connections had put them in charge of distribution. The truck tonight was carrying more than just guns. It was part of something bigger, a shipment that could end up in the hands of the wrong people, fueling violence across the country, maybe even beyond. James couldn't let that happen. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about stopping something before it got worse. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, checking his watch. He had less than an hour before the shipment hit its rendezvous point, a secluded warehouse just outside of town, where it would be transferred to another vehicle and disappear forever. James wasn't going to let it make it that far. The plan was simple: intercept the truck, neutralize resistance, take control of the shipment. But simple didn't mean easy. Whoever was moving these weapons wasn't going to let them go without a fight. James had followed their operation long enough to know how they worked. Tight security, multiple vehicles running escort, trained men who knew how to handle themselves. He had one advantage: they didn't know they were being hunted. James pulled off the main road and onto an old dirt trail that ran parallel to Route 16. The path was rough, overgrown with weeds, but it gave him a direct view of the highway without being seen. He shut off his lights and coasted to a stop, pulling a pair of night vision binoculars from the passenger seat. Then he waited. Minutes passed. Then there it was. A black semi-truck, its trailer stretching long and heavy, rolling steadily down the road. Flanking it were two SUVs, moving in formation, their drivers trained to spot trouble before it could get too close. Security detail. James smirked. They were expecting an ambush. They just weren't expecting him. He moved fast. James threw his truck into gear, gunned the engine, and cut across the field, kicking up dust and dirt as he barreled toward the highway. By the time the first escort SUV noticed him, it was already too late. James slammed into its side, the impact sending the vehicle skidding toward the ditch. It veered off the road, tires screeching, crashing nose first into the muddy embankment. One down. The second SUV reacted immediately, swerving in front of the semi to block James's path. James anticipated it. He reached into the glove compartment, grabbed a small homemade EMP device, and hurled it out the window, right onto the SUV's hood. The device detonated, sending an electronic pulse through the vehicle's systems. The SUV's engine died instantly, its headlights flickering out as the driver fought for control. James didn't wait to see how it played out. He was already gunning straight for the semi. The truck driver saw him coming and reacted exactly how James expected. He stomped the gas, trying to outrun him. But the semi was too big, too slow. James pulled up alongside it, matching speed. Then, with the kind of precision that only came from years of high-risk operations, he opened the door, climbed onto the roof of his own truck, and leapt, landing hard against the side of the moving semi. He caught the edge of the driver's door, fingers clamping onto the metal as the wind roared in his ears. The driver inside, a heavily tattooed man with Storm Rider's ink, saw him and reached for his gun. James moved first. He kicked the door open, the impact sending the driver flying out of the cab. For a split second, James watched the man tumble onto the pavement, rolling into the darkness. Then he pulled himself inside. He grabbed the wheel just in time, correcting the truck before it could veer into the ditch. The air inside the cab was thick with adrenaline, the dashboard glowing with flashing alerts. The truck was still moving at full speed, but James wasn't worried about that. He was focused on what was inside the trailer. James reached for the emergency brake, pulling the massive vehicle to a screeching halt. The tires groaned, the entire semi shaking as it finally stopped in the middle of the highway. He jumped out, shotgun in hand, and moved toward the trailer. He already knew what he would find, but seeing it with his own eyes, that made it real. James yanked open the trailer doors, and his breath came slow. Inside, stacked from floor to ceiling, were military-grade weapons. Not just rifles, not just handguns, explosives, grenade launchers, armor-piercing rounds. This wasn't just a weapons shipment. This was enough firepower to start a war. James clenched his jaw. The Storm Riders were just a distraction. The real operation was something much bigger. Someone was building an army, and now James had proof. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance. James pulled out his secure phone, dialed a number, and spoke 2 words. "It's done." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the shipment for law enforcement to find. He could have kept the weapons. He could have tried to take the fight straight to whoever was behind this. But James knew better. This wasn't just about one shipment. This was about sending a message. The people behind this thought they were untouchable, that no one could stop them. They were wrong. And now, whoever was funding this operation, they were going to realize something very important. James Cooper wasn't just some farmer. He was the man who was going to end them. James drove home as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the weight of the night settling into his bones. He had spent years trying to forget who he was, trying to build a quiet life. But fate had other plans, and maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to accept it. Because some men were meant for war. Some men were meant to stand between the innocent and the wolves. And James, he was one of them,